Here we are in the middle of the city, the Melbourne CBD. We thought we'd come back into the city, and today, after last week's attempt at failed comedy, we've got a serious topic. Now, I normally don't get surprised. I've been around a long time. I like to think I've got my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community, but I was actually surprised by some statistics which I came across at the end of last year, before the COVID-19 crisis, that Australians, the key word is Australians, were the second most medicated population in the world for anxiety. Okay? I'll repeat it again. As far as anxiety is concerned, Australians are the second most medicated population in the world. Now, we have people risking their lives, and many have died trying to get here as refugees and asylum seekers. And as far as the world is concerned, this is the land of milk and honey. We've got a universal healthcare system, we've got a pharmaceutical benefits scheme, we've got an adequate social security system. It's not the best, but it's there. We've got a social security net. We have a trade union movement. We have supposedly freedom of expression. We have elections every 3 years. And we supposedly don't live in poverty, dire poverty. So you wonder why there is so much anxiety in the Australian community. Now, if I was living in the Democratic Republic of the Congo today, I'd be anxious. They've got 2 Ebola outbreaks in the Congo, which they're trying to contain. Kinshasa, the capital city, is locked down because of the COVID-19 crisis and the spread of COVID-19 in the Congo. They're in the midst of a civil war which has been raging for over a decade, and over 8,000 children have died from measles in the last 2 months because the immunisation program has been stopped. So I would be concerned. I'd be anxious. I'd be anxious in a country like that. But I'm living in Australia. I'm here in the middle of the CBD. I'm talking to you. There's people around me. There aren't police here with submachine guns. Most people have got enough to eat. Most people are clothed. Most people are on a social security system that need to be on a social security system. We've got access to universal health care. So why do we have so much anxiety? Is it because of us as individuals? Is anxiety a specifically Australian condition, or is it due to the institutional structures and the situation we find ourselves in this country? Because you want to understand, you can treat anxiety in 3 ways. Many people self-medicate, alcohol and drugs. People take alcohol and drugs because it makes them feel better, it decreases anxiety levels initially. So there are many people in the community who are anxious but are self-medicating for alcohol and drugs. Then we've got the pharmaceutical industry, which has a huge hold on this country, and a lot of people are treated for anxiety with medications. The great thing about anxiety medication is you've got to take it regularly. It's a great profit motivator for pharmaceutical companies. They have a lot of impact on local doctors, and a lot of doctors don't actually have time to deal with anxiety, and they give people a prescription. So that's another thing. A third way to treat anxiety, or partially treat anxiety, is through exercise, yoga, consciousness raising programs, etc. Diverting your attention, diversion of attention. So they're all ways of treating anxiety, but that doesn't actually address the problem. Is it an individual problem? Is it a structural problem? Is it something peculiar to Australia and peculiar to Western societies, which theoretically their citizens live in a stable, secure environment? All right, let's look at it. Now, in my opinion, a significant proportion of anxiety is not because of individual failings, it's not because of the individual, because of the situation the individual finds themselves in. Because you've got enough clothes and food and a social security net and you're in a secure environment, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have huge levels of anxiety. And people can be very poor and live in very marginal conditions but not suffer from anxiety because they know what's going to happen from day to day. They know what's going to happen from day to day. The issue in Australia is most Australians are anxious because they're not sure of what's going to happen tomorrow to them as individuals. And most of that insecurity is directly related to the structures which we have allowed to envelop us over the last 40 years during the privatisation, deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation era. For example, let's look at young people. There's a lot of anxiety amongst young people. There are extraordinary high rates of suicide compared to other people, and especially in minority groups. There's an extraordinary amount of pressure placed on young people from the very young, at preschool to university. The fact that we have a very competitive education system where you end up as an adult is directly related to the type of education you receive and the type of marks you do. The fact that we have a NAPLAN testing in very young primary school children, the fact that anybody who graduates from a university is saddled with a debt which can take a decade or two or three to overcome, and the fact that the fact that it's quite competitive in these environments means that as far as young people are concerned, there's an exceptionally high level of anxiety. Performance anxiety, anxiety in terms of how people look because of social media, anxiety when you compare yourself, to 7 supermodels when there are 7 billion people on the planet. So there is all this anxiety which is induced to a significant degree by social media, where you're constantly on edge, concerned about what people are going to say about you, how they're going to react to you, how your friends and peers react. So there's this constant 24-hour surveillance, social media surveillance, not in terms of people looking into your bedroom and seeing what you're up to, but surveillance in terms of your every activity being a forum or for criticism by other people. So there's that anxiety. And I think with the introduction of social media, there has been a much increased levels of anxiety as people tend to compare themselves to other people. And the fact is that a lot of social media people just put up fake accounts of themselves, and you're trying to compare yourself with something that doesn't exist. So there's this constant tension when people are young. Now, when we move to the next phase of life, when people are looking for a job in order to make their way in the world, it's exceptionally difficult, because today, in 2020, most jobs for younger people are part-time, they're insecure, they're in a non-unionised workforce, and they are at the behest of their employer as far as their employment capacity is concerned. So what that means is that you're constantly on edge. Will you have a job tomorrow? Will you have enough shifts? Do you have enough money to pay the rent? Do you have enough money to clothe yourself? Do you have enough money to go on a holiday? And the list goes on. And it's all dependent on the type of job you have. Now, if you're a university graduate and you're in some type of semi-permanent job, then you've got the task of actually crawling up the ladder of success. So as far as young people is concerned, because there is no security in the type of job you do, because of the introduction of short-term contracts in many facets of existence, there's this constant anxiety about whether you'll actually be able to meet your financial commitments. Then there's the anxiety with social media of you comparing yourself with your friends, your peers. Are you dressed the right way? Are you doing the right thing? Are you speaking the right way? And the list goes on and on. So again, there's this constant 24-hour surveillance. Not a surveillance in terms of a camera directly focused on you, but a surveillance directly focused on your activities as an individual, as part of a family, as part of a community. Then we get to the third stage of life, when you take on a lot more responsibilities. You've got a family, you've got a mortgage, you've got a job. Now, this is one of the most difficult times in people's lives, and it's no accident to find that people in their 40s and 50s are the ones who suffer a huge amount of anxiety, because again, they find themselves in a situation where they are financially geared up to their neck. We are one of the most indebted nations on earth as far as individuals are concerned. Whether it's credit cards, whether it's extraordinary amounts of money that need to be repaid to keep a roof over your head if you have a mortgage. Because of government policy in terms of negative gearing, because the real estate market has been turned into an investment market where overseas buyers actually own about 30% of real estate in this country and put upward pressure on prices, you find that it's extremely difficult to enter the housing market and to get a mortgage. And if you get a mortgage, it's not unusual for people having a $500,000 mortgage or a $750,000 mortgage for a 4-bedroom house somewhere within 20 kilometres of the CBD of a major capital city. So there's an extraordinary pressure. And then if you're on individual contracts, the difference between poverty and a good life is 6 weeks' wages. You don't get 6 weeks' wages, you find yourself in a difficult situation. And as a lot of work is insecure, contract-based, non-unionised, it's quite easy for employers to put extra pressure on you, to demand extra hours of work for which you're not paid for, to demand that you're on 24-hour call, and at the same time you've got all the pressures of trying to maintain a relationship, trying to keep your children at school, trying to be a parent, and that's why they talk about this work-life balance, which is a lot of garbage. It's all about work balance because that's the income you need to maintain the lifestyle you require. So in this section of the population, anxiety is a huge issue, and people tend to self-medicate initially, then maybe go to their local doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, be put on medications, and they attempt to, cope with the situation. Then we've got I think one of the more tragic situations, as tragic as the competition which occurs amongst young children, and this is the elderly. The elderly are really not touched by social media. Old people aren't as significantly affected as by social media as their younger peers. They've actually got their personality, they know who they are, they don't really care what other people think. They've reached that stage of their lives. But there has been a significant change in old age in Australia in the last 40 years. With the introduction of superannuation, which I describe as the privatisation of old age, where you pay for your own old age. That's what superannuation is about. What's happened is that people's future as an elderly person is intertwined with the future of the capitalist system, is intertwined with the future of private investment for private profit, intertwined with the stock market, with hedge funds, and so many people no longer rely on pensions, they rely on self-managed super funds or other industry-based super funds or privately based super funds to invest their money for them to ensure they have a reasonable old age. And what we see all the time is a significant drop in the value of people's assets over 2 to 3 days or a week, whether it's the 1987 financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, or the COVID-19 crisis. People who think their future is assured, they've got enough money to live a reasonable lifestyle, if they can actually get into a nursing home when they're very old, if they need support, fine, they can't have it. So every day, especially people who rely on superannuation payments, every day their future is determined by what happens in institutions which are outside their immediate control, like industry-based super funds, like privately based super funds, like self-managed super funds. They are basically the vagaries of the world's stock markets and their ability to create a profit. So for a lot of elderly people, when old age should be a period of retirement where you kind of rest on your laurels and people come to you and ask you about, your experiences and what you can offer the community, it's an increasing era of agitation and anxiety. You don't know how long the money's going to last. You don't know when you're going to go in a nursing home. You don't know if you're going to be ripped off when you go into a nursing home. You don't know what type of care you're going to receive. We have nuclear families. We don't have extended families. You can't rely on your children and your grandchildren to look after you. So you're relying on commercial forces to look after you as you grow elderly. So at every phase of our life as Australians, whether it's as children, whether it's young people embarking on a career, whether it's people who've got an established career who are embarking on having a family and having a home, or whether it's the elderly. At every phase of our life, although we have a universal healthcare system, although we have a pharmaceutical benefit system, although we have a social security system which has got bigger and bigger holes in it, but it's still there, and although most people are not dying of starvation in this country, and although we're not in the midst of a civil war or constant or in a war or of aggression against another country, the facts are that at the individual level, because of structural issues, because of capitalism, the need to create private profit from private investment, because we have allowed governments to remove many of the protections which were built up by forebearers over the last 4 decades during that deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution that swept the country. We now find that we are paying the price, and that price is individual anxiety. And it's really not worth that price that every phase of your existence you feel insecurity. And the key to decreasing anxiety in a community and in individuals is to offer security. So what I'm saying to you is, if you want a different type of life, if you don't want to feel insecure, if you don't want your children and grandchildren to grow up in an insecure environment where they're under constant 24-hour surveillance through social media, not, as I said, video surveillance, but surveillance on their behaviour by their peers and the people around them, then I think it's time that you think seriously about joining public interest before corporate interest and get involved in a political, social and cultural organisation that through direct action and electoral politics hopes to change the very fundamental nature of this society so that we will become a secure people, secure individuals in a secure environment with a secure future.